Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Gaming with me, Tony Mo, and I want to have a little bit of a discussion regarding Battlefield 1, now that we're at the point where anyone who's interested in BF1 has seen the multiplayer gameplay. They've watched the reveal stream, they've seen some of their favorite YouTubers posting their perspectives of that stream. People have seen the multiplayer, at least as it exists on one specific map and environment in one specific game mode, Conquest. But there's still a lot to talk about. And I think a lot of people are asking the question, how World War I is Battlefield 1? So I wanted to discuss that topic and talk about a lot of the, different elements that I think tie into that specific question that I see so many people asking, I think rightfully so, across the internet, whether it's on, YouTube comments or on forums or on, the website or on Twitter. People are asking this question pretty heavily. So let's break some of these elements down. And I think the first place to start are some of the things that don't seem or aren't actually 100% authentic inside of Battlefield 1's multiplayer. But this is something that we also need to recognize. And I know that a lot of people get this, the idea that you can't always design a game just to be 100% authentic or realistic. You need to have the game be fun. And you also need to recognize that DICE is still developing a Battlefield game. It has to cater to the Battlefield community and audience that already exists. They can't just alienate this massive community that they've built over the years for the sake of making a 100% authentic World War I experience. And I know we don't have a lot of games like that, and I think a lot of people were hoping that Battlefield 1 would end up like, AAA version of Verdun, but that simply was never going to be the case. Verdun's an amazing game, it really is, but it appeals, in my opinion, to a very different type of playstyle and potentially a very different crowd than Battlefield 1. I like Verdun, but it's freaking hardcore. It is not an easy game. It's not the sort of pick up with your buddies and have a good laugh. It's the kind of sit down, hunker down, get serious, because this game's going to give you a thrashing. And Verdun's awesome for that. And of course, it focuses heavily on trench warfare during the Battle of Verdun. I strongly recommend you check the game out. If you have a PC, it is actually going to be coming to Xbox One and PS4 this summer, I believe late August. So keep an eye out for that. It's definitely worth checking out and playing on your way towards Battlefield 1. But let's get back to Battlefield 1. And let's start by talking about weapons and vehicles and sort of the restrictions or the lack of restrictions that we're seeing on this stuff in the game's multiplayer. Now, a lot of people have already made it very clear that they understand that these weapons exist. DICE isn't just pulling these out of their arse. These are weapons that existed, but most of them existed in a prototype format. A lot of the scopes that we're seeing, again, existed in a prototype format. They were not abundant. So right there is, I think, the number one marker for a lot of people when it comes to that lack of authenticity, is that there's such a large number of people running around with SMGs or scoped rifles. It's a game. We have to understand that, again, they can't do everything just around the concept of preserving authenticity. The weapons are real. Yes, the number of those weapons may not be real. And a lot of us recognize that World War I was a war fought with minimal supplies. And we all know that not everyone was running around with the best in class of prototype scopes on their bolt-action rifles, or the best in class of prototype SMGs. But this is a game and they have to make it enjoyable. So I personally was never expecting them to take things that far. Now, another element that I've seen a lot of people point out is the fact that there seems to be no class, or I should say faction-specific weapons or vehicles. So the German Empire isn't just using Lugers. The British Empire isn't, isn't just using their weapons. They're actually using Lugers. They're using 1911s. The Germans are using 1911s. They're driving each other's tanks. They're using each other's weapons. They're flying each other's planes. This is something that Battlefield did away with after Battlefield 3, and personally, I'm okay with that. I've never cared for the class, or as I said, the faction-specific weapons. I didn't like it in Battlefield 3, and I always felt it was odd eventually being able to unlock the other faction's weapons. To me, it was like, why not just make all of the weapons available from the get-go? That's a difficult design decision, because when you make faction-specific weapons, you limit the number of weapons that any player can have depending on their faction, and that does actually start to wear on a lot of people. I think a lot of people look at that like, well, there's not actually that many weapons, because when I'm playing this faction, I can only use this weapon. I think from a gameplay decision perspective, it's smart to not do faction-specific weapons, but I really would like to hear what you guys have to say on this one, because this is very subjective, and everyone's going to have a different thought and a different opinion on how this could enhance or possibly unenhance, deter, negatively affect their experience. So let me know your thoughts on it. I really want to hear what you guys have to say about the whole lack of faction-restricted weapons, vehicles, so on and so forth. So those are really the three big ones that I see a lot of people talking about. And I said I think they are worthwhile questions to bring up, but I think the answer almost always ends up being it's a video game. And at the end of the day, DICE needs to do what they need to do to make sure that it's the best Battlefield it can be. And if these are the decisions that they feel they need to make it as fun as it can be, then so be it. You know, I'm not going to sit here and scream lack of authenticity, you know, over the sake of gameplay and enjoyment. I want the gameplay to be as good as it possibly can. If that means removing some of that authenticity, then I'm okay with that. And as I said, I personally never expected this to be hardcore authentic. I expected a Battlefield game in the setting and the environments that existed in World War I with some of the weaponry and the equipment and, you know, a lot of the small bits and pieces that were World War I. And I think they're doing a good job with that. You know, I like the limitations on the scope technology that we did see. While it was excessively abundant during the stream, which was a little bit frustrating. I'll talk a little bit more about that towards the end here. I like that most of the zoom levels that we saw on these scoped weapons were fairly low. I think it's important that the Recon class, especially in this setting, has their engagement range extremely limited. You know, there was a lot of negatives, I think, that were brought up with the ridiculous scope variants that we saw in Battlefield 4 that made the Recon class excessively annoying, more than it had ever been in the franchise. I want to see Recon classes thrown into the fray and forced to use concealment in order to stay alive while they support their team, not distance. I talked about this with the reveal discussion. Fingers crossed that this ends up coming to fruition. So let's talk a little bit about the things that I am concerned about, probably as equally as most of you are. And I've already had discussion with several of you guys on these two topics. Number one is the lack of actual gameplay showing off iron sight variants of these bolt action and semi-automatic weapons. A lot of stuff that we saw were semi-automatic and bolt action weapons with scopes on them, with bipods. Clearly variants set up for more long-range sniping applications. A lot of us, though, want to run around in close quarters with a good old bolt-action rifle and iron sights and take the heads off of the enemy team. I love that. That's an excessively satisfying feeling. Call of Duty 2 did it amazingly well. Some of the old Battlefields did it really well. World at War did it really well. And I think that's what a lot of us are remembering when we think about bolt-action, you know, bolt-action rifles with iron sights. We want that satisfaction. We want to be that guy sitting inside of the town, you know, peeking through the dark window, you know, popping heads off of the German Empire as they rush in to try and capture objective apples. I like that they did that too, man. It's, you know, it's funny because so many people are like, that's not right, it's Alpha and Bravo, but they didn't have the same NATO, you know, the phonetic alphabet they had back then for call signs. You know, they use just common everyday things. I like that they preserved that. I thought that was wicked cool. So much like many of you guys, I'm hoping for more iron sight variants. I think if they actually launched the game without iron sight variants for the bolt action weapons, that's kind of blasphemy, and that's going to be really upsetting because to me it doesn't make sense as to why they wouldn't do that. Every single weapon that has an iron sight should have an iron sight variant. It's as simple as that. It should be all about player choice there. I'm looking forward to doing some awesome sniping, close quarters with my squad, you know, from a slightly raised position with an iron sight rifle. I know a lot of you are, and hopefully they deliver on that. Now, last, in something that we can only really speculate on, as we have only seen one map with the stream that they did, is hopes of more diverse locations. Now, the location that we saw obviously did not feature much, if at any, trench warfare. It was more of a town environment. It made use of a lot of different building locations, a lot of, you know, valley and environmental elevation rises. I totally dug it. And I think it's important that the whole game isn't trench warfare, but it's also important that the game doesn't completely exclude hardcore trench warfare. And I hope that we'll very much see a map like the Battle of Verdun that is really focused on trench warfare, that has us using our bayonets and SMGs and, you know, create some really awesome close quarters combat environments. You know, there's some awesome potential to have that huge variety in the map locations, to take us to more open settings, to take us back to the trenches, to really switch things up. That's going to make, you know, going from map to map really, really interesting. And I'm hopeful about seeing a lot of that. And one of the things for me, in case you guys haven't noticed, they have a bit of a marketing blurb. I'll have it post it down in the description below regarding one of the game modes that was announced called Operations. So Operations is a sort of multi-location match. You know, a lot of games have tried to do this. Just recently, Evolve did it. You know, the idea that you start fighting on one map, and then the outcome of that decides the next map that you fight on, and you go across like multiple areas. So in the case of Operations, you have the attacking team and the defending team. The attacking team is obviously trying to push the defending team back from location to location. And in the blurb itself, they talk a lot about the defending team being hunkered into the trenches, you know, trying to use their mounted machine gun emplacements and the rifles to hold themselves down, while the friendlies are teaming up, or I should say the attackers, are teaming up to push out of the trench into the enemy trenches and clear them out and keep pushing them back from location to location. And they have said they're going to try and, you know, emulate or at least capture some of the battles that actually happened in World War I with this. So that, to me, shows a lot of promise for, you know, diversity in the maps and the locations and the environments that we're going to see inside of Battlefield 1. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I am concerned about right now, is that there won't be enough diversity in the locations. This is a prime opportunity to do that, you know, to really give us something fresh in terms of map design. So those are my two hopefuls, guys. Let me know, you know, what you really want to see happen in Battlefield 1, whether it's trench warfare or more iron sight variants of these bolt-action rifles. Is there anything that has you concerned? And let's talk a little bit about that, you know, that subjective opinion. What does a World War I game look like to you? What did you expect from Battlefield? What elements of what you've seen of Battlefield 1 don't make it seem very World War I to you, or make it seem very World War I to you? Let me know down in the comment section below. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next one.